We have a wonderful opportunity tonight to discuss one of the greatest thinkers and writers of revolutionary and post-revolutionary France, and perhaps the first woman intellectual to set before us, well, actually the first intellectual to set before us the question of the political fate of Europe. And perhaps because of her alienated condition as a woman, Madame de Staël has the critical distance to present to us the entire unfolding spectacle of modernity. Madame de Staël was born in 1766 in the glamour of the Ancien Régime, that is those years before the French Revolution, in which the aristocracy, the monarchy, and the Catholic Church held sway in France. Her father was the Swiss Jacques Necker, the celebrated finance minister to Louis XVI. He balanced the books, so he was lauded by rich and poor alike. But he also, when it came to the gathering of the Estates General in 1789, he helped to secure the individual voting procedure, which earned the wrath of the king. And so he had to flee back to Switzerland. On the way, the Bastille fell, and the people of France carried his carriage back to Paris in triumph. The young Germaine remembered this all her life, this scene of universal adoration, and that it made a deep impression on her, something it seems she might have craved. If we think about her passage on glory, no doubt this event was foremost in her mind. Her mother, Suzanne, ran one of the most important salons of enlightenment in Paris. Germaine grew up in the company of the likes of Diderot and d'Alembert. She was a brilliant, prodigious child. She also endured something of an Electra complex. She was affectively devoted to her father, and that, if we want to psychoanalyze, that may or may not have had something to do with the number of lovers she would have. Germaine became Madame de Staël at the age of 19 when she married the man who would become the Swedish ambassador to France. She bore one child who died young to her husband, and she bore other children to other men. She did take many lovers during her life. Her first was Bishop Talleyrand, that great survivor who flourished under the Ancien Régime, under the revolution, the Empire, and the Restoration. One would have to be very unscrupulous, of course, to survive all those circumstances. Madame de Staël endured multiple exiles during both revolutionary and Napoleonic times. When she was exiled by Napoleon, she traveled all over Europe. The poet and critic Auguste Schlegel was a traveling companion in those times. She eventually repaired to Chateau Coppet on Lake Geneva, where she established a glittering salon of her own, whose visitors included Byron. Madame de Staël lived and thought through the trauma of the French Revolution, and that's very important in general, and it's very important for us in the course of reading we've had. It matters because the French Revolution really is the fulcrum of modernity, and it's one really can't overstate the importance of this event in all, as far as a culmination of all that we've read in terms of the Reformation and the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, and then it's going to determine next semester's reading the world we live in, the age of ideology, and so on. De Staël was the great catalyst for the liberal opposition to Napoleon, and she really created that reality, and that's a remarkable feat. Her nuanced view of the French Revolution as both a necessary and a horrific thing establishes the parameters of continental liberalism. So that's it's harder for an American to understand, I think, especially if you have a conservative bent, why anybody would think anything good about the French Revolution. But in the mind of Europe, that was the great event of liberty. No matter how, even if one acknowledges how horrendous the terror is, as one must acknowledge it, or the self-contradiction and result of that pursuit of liberty resulting in the empire, right, and Napoleon becoming dictator. Even if one recognizes these things, there is still this sense that what happened in 1789 mattered for the future of the world, but because of Western Europe's predominance in the time since that revolution, it's something we need to enter into and try to understand through. And I think it's very good to have a guide like de Staël, who's balanced in these matters. In grappling with the French Revolution, de Staël encompasses the whole range of modern concerns and does so with a quality of insight that helps us understand who we've come to be. So there's a question here of, and we'll see this in the questions that have been put forward for our orientation. How much can Romanticism be separated from the Enlightenment, or the Enlightenment from Romanticism? How much can German idealism, which will follow, be separated from either of those two movements that preceded it? In a way, it seems that all of modernity comes to a head in these times, the French Revolution, and unfolds from its logic. The first selection comes from the influence of the passions on the happiness of individuals and nations. That's the one that's in the book. That's a 1796 work. So when she's saying we needed some distance from the terror, of course, you know, the terror had just ended, but it began in 1793 with the execution of Louis XVI and the ascendancy of Robespierre and the Jacobins and the Committee on Public Safety. That after killing tens of thousands by the guillotine and by, and tens of thousands more in terms of the military ventures that both to suppress internal dissent from the revolution and to deal with the counter-revolutionary European forces. Eventually, the revolution, the terror ate its own children, as has been said, and Robespierre himself fell to the guillotine. So this had just closed this chapter in the very long story of the revolution, which would go on different phases for a decade, right? And so it's still in the midst of it that she writes this work. So it's still kind of remarkable that she's able to get the distance that she's got to do what she's done. The second selection, which didn't make it into the book, but was emailed out, is from her 1802 epistolary novel, Delphine. And I hope you got a chance to look at those passages. In any case, we'll read some of those passages because the depth of of de Staël's critique of the implied critique of the social order it's devastating. Of course, these two women that whose accounts, the autobiographies basically we have, are giving I think a very penetrating sense of how desperate the situation of a woman is who doesn't have independent means to advance in the world. And that was part of the whole question the French Revolution put before the world. That is the question of political and social equality, not only as in the American Revolution, the achievement of a political equality still, which of course did not include the women. We did not, despite Abigail Adams' truly important and prophetic words, remember the ladies, we didn't do that, and nobody did. But besides the political, there's the deeper question of the social arrangements, the family and all of that. And in the French Revolution, the questions of divorce were put on the table, the questions of egalitarian inheritance, these basic mechanisms by which life is reproduced were put on the table. And we're still dealing with the effects of that. We need to think about what it would take for true emancipation of women, true emancipation in terms of human flourishing for everyone, including children. And so I think it's very important to read these most compelling accounts of women's lives that de Staël has produced for us in that work. If we look at the questions, number one, the French Revolution epitomizes the inseparability of enlightenment from the shadow it would obliterate, a shadow Pascal had already conjured in his anguished existentialism. Madame de Staël sums up in herself the drama of the early modern period as it opens out into its long aftermath. Is she an enlightened philosophe, a liberal, a romantic, an existentialist, an idealist? And I obviously that's a very open question, but when you read her, what persona stands out to you? Number two, de Staël indicates the damage wrought by great men with their great passions and seems to be indicating the historical trauma inflicted by narcissism. What does she identify as the supreme obstacle to happiness, both personal and political? How could renunciation of happiness as a goal make happiness more possible? Number three, de Staël seems to want to isolate a Rousseauian still point, the satisfactions of self-consciousness, above the dialectic of enlightenment and romanticism. What is her philosopher like? Is he or she characterized by mindfulness, dissociation, or solipsism? And one thing I should note here is one of the controversial aspects of this work is that there is an implied discussion in the selections we've got, it's implied, about suicide as a way of a mode of authenticity, as it were. And that's, so besides the great questions that are tangentially put on the table for us by her selections in Delphine on the status of women, there's also this other social question about the how do we stand towards suicide. And number four is de Staël blaming women for their oppression in the section on vanity from the influence. Is she merely being realistic about social possibilities? What feminist critique of the social order may be found in the selections from Delphine? What possibilities for emancipation might be inferred from the devastating portraits she draws?